Hi friends, welcome back to the Avocado Toast Budget. Today is going to be part 1 in a series where I talk about why I don't follow Dave Ramsey and what we disagree on. Now, if you follow me on my other social media channels, you already probably know that I am very outspoken about why I disagree with Dave Ramsey and what we disagree on, but I had a lot of questions about that, so I wanted to break it all down in a video for you, try to make this as educational as possible, but also entertaining at the same time. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to break this down into multiple parts, and part 1, which is what you're watching today, is going to be all of the financial reasons that I disagree with him. So if you want to learn more about saving, investing, paying off debt, and how to finally feel more confident with your money, make sure that you hit that subscribe button down below. Also, push that notification bell, that way you get notified every single time that I upload. And if you enjoy hearing me rant about Dave Ramsey, make sure that you click that thumbs up button. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm, helps boost this video to the top so that more people can find this content. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I just want to put out a quick disclaimer that this is not bashing on Dave Ramsey. This is not me telling you that you shouldn't follow him. Ultimately, I am all for doing whatever is best for you, but since he is one of the most influential people in the personal finance community, I feel that it's important to talk about some of the things that I disagree with and even some of the things that I think can be harmful. All of these are just my opinion, but I am not going to just sit here and spew nonsense. I am going to have all of the information and the links that I used and the research that I did linked down below in the description box. Most of this comes from Dave Ramsey's website itself, just so that you know that I'm not just making things up and that I know what I'm talking about. Okay, so now that that's over, let's get into it. Financial aspect number 1 that we disagree on: credit scores. Dave Ramsey's take on credit scores are that they're not important and all they are is a quote, "I love debt" score. In fact, on his website, this is how he describes what makes up your credit score. He says 35% of your credit score is based on your debt history, 30% of it is based on your debt level, 15% is based on the length of time that you've had debt, 10% is based on new debt, and the other 10% is based on the type of debt that you have. Now, when I was doing my research for this video and I read that, it really pissed me off because I feel like describing credit scores this way to people is so misleading. Because he wants to frame credit scores as a bad thing and just as an "I love debt" score and nothing else, he chooses to frame them in a way that I honestly don't think is entirely truthful, or at least at minimum very misleading to people. I'm going to put up here on the screen an unbiased view of what your credit score is made up of. He says that 35% of your score is based on your debt history. That is not true. It is based off of your payment history. It is just about if you are making your payments on time. And this doesn't require you to be in any debt that is racking up any interest. In fact, if you want to learn more about credit scores and how to build up your credit score without ever having to even be in any debt, I will link my Credit Score 101 video all up here so you can learn actually what credit scores are and decide if they matter for you. Now, the second part of your credit score that makes up 30% of it, he describes as your debt level. What it actually is your credit utilization, which all this means is just how much credit do you have available to you versus how much of it are you using. So in reality, for this section of your credit score to be high, the idea is that you're using almost none of the credit that you have available to you. The only part of this that I feel like isn't misleading is the last part where he says 10% of your credit score is made up by the different types of debt that you have. Now, that is true, but that is only 10% of your credit score. And you absolutely do not have to be in tons of high interest debt for your credit score to be high. Now, the reason that Dave Ramsey advocates against credit scores and tries to paint them in this negative light is that he says if you are debt-free or working toward debt freedom, you should never need a credit score again. This is objectively not true. He completely glazes over the times in your life where credit scores can make a difference and they have nothing to do with debt. Certain landlords will run a credit check before they are willing to rent to you. So if you have low credit or no credit, this could mean that you're spending more on rent because your options are limited. Now, do I think that this is right? Absolutely not. But is this the reality for many people? Unfortunately, yes. Jobs can also ask for a modified version of your credit report. And this can influence job levels, clearance, or even if you get accepted to a certain position. On top of that, a lot of times you can save a lot of money in car insurance if you have a higher credit score. So these are different ways that certain financial aspects of your life rely on credit scores that have nothing to do with debt. And honestly, in my opinion, choosing to completely leave all of this information out and act like it's no big deal is really irresponsible, and it puts people in a situation where they might end up paying more money because they were told that their credit score doesn't matter. And the final reason that I disagree with him about credit scores is that ultimately telling people to wreck their credit scores to get out of debt negatively impacts marginalized groups of people. People of color, disabled people, women, people in the LGBTQ community, people of low income, these are all people who are at higher risk of needing to take on debt or being put in a situation where their credit score is going to make a big difference on whether they get accepted for loans or inflows of cash that are life-saving and necessary for them. I think telling people that credit scores don't matter at all comes from a place of privilege. Are credit scores the number one most important thing? Absolutely not. Are they a reflection of your worth as a human being or of your overall financial health? No way. But for me, the problem with his advice about credit scores lies in the fact that he is so black and white about it. Credit scores are an I love debt score. Debt is bad, therefore you shouldn't have debt and you shouldn't care about your credit score. And this type of thinking can end people up in really tough situations. Financial aspect number 2 that we disagree on, gazelle intensity. Now, in case you didn't know, Dave's whole justification for gazelle intensity comes from a Bible verse. I want to point this out because a lot of times when I bring this up, people say that it's a metaphor, that when he just says, eat rice and beans, sell everything, that the kids think that they're next, have no fun, give everything up until you are debt-free, that you just need to take it with a grain of salt and that he doesn't really mean it. And he has whole blog posts on this that I will link down below that clearly show that this is not a metaphor and that he truly believes that you need to sprint toward debt freedom. And in these same posts, he is heavily implying that you have both an ethical and a spiritual obligation to be debt-free. Now, there are a lot of things that I think that are really wrong about that, and I will probably talk about more of that in part 2. However, from a financial standpoint, having this gazelle intensity is not always the best thing. Teaching people how to sprint toward debt freedom is not sustainable. And I believe that focusing so hard on just paying off debt leaves out so many other aspects about financial health that are really important goals for people to have as well. Things like saving money, spending money on the things that you love, and investing are all just as important, if not more important, than paying off debt. And on top of this, part of the gazelle intensity is that you don't just pay off your debt, but you close that account as well, which negatively impacts your credit like we were talking about in point number 1. And again, the issue that I have with this, much like the credit scores, is how black and white his thinking and his teachings are. There is no room for interpreting it the way that you want to. People tell me this all of the time when they are trying to defend Dave. They say things like, he didn't mean this literally, take it with a grain of salt, do the aspects that work for you, leave the rest that don't, which for most advice I think is pretty solid, except for the fact that Dave explicitly tells you that you're not supposed to do that. Dave says multiple times on his website that the baby steps are meant to be done in the order that he has them listed as he has them listed. I'm going to read a quote from his website, and I'm sorry, I'll be looking down word for word because I want to make sure that I get this right. He says, here's a pro tip. Don't get ahead of yourself and work the steps out of order or do the plan-ish. No matter how tempting it is, don't try to pay off debt while still funding your 401k or buy a home while you still have student loans breathing down your neck. That split focus isn't going to get the job done. For this to really work, you have to follow the steps in order. Trust us, it's called a proven plan for a reason. There we have it, right out of Dave's mouth. His plan is not intended to be taken with a grain of salt. So if we are supposed to interpret his plan at face value, that's what I'm gonna do. And I do not agree in a financial plan that leaves no room for people to decide what is important to them personally in their lives and their financial health. If you want to pay off debt going gazelle intense, awesome, go for it. But if you want to pay off debt and invest and save some money, or if you want to buy a home while you still have student loans because they're going to take you forever and a year to pay off anyway, go for it. That is your right, and it does not make you any less financially savvy than the person next to you. Financial aspect number 3 that we disagree on, the $1,000 emergency fund. Dave Ramsey's baby step number 1 is to save up $1,000 for emergencies until you are debt-free, except for the mortgage. And as I just mentioned, he does clearly state that the steps are to be done in the order that he has them, exactly as he has them written. So his claim, by telling you that you need a $1,000 emergency fund until you are debt-free, is that $1,000 is enough for you to sustain any life thing that comes along until you are out of debt. I absolutely disagree with this. And to put this into perspective, Dave came up with these baby steps in the 90s, and he has yet to change literally anything about them, including the original $1,000 emergency fund, which, if we take into inflation, today that would be worth about $2,000. So at minimum, if he is going with the plan that he started in the 90s, keeping up with inflation, he should be recommending a $2,000 emergency fund to everyone. Now, I still don't think that this is enough for most people, but I do think at $2,000 is at least better than $1,000. My issue with this is that it puts people in a compromised situation. You are not less likely to need your emergency fund when you are in debt. In fact, I would argue that you're probably more likely to need your emergency fund while you're still paying off debt. Nowadays, $1,000 doesn't cover really anything. It doesn't cover most people's rent or their mortgage, and it probably isn't going to fix any major issue that your car might have. So what happens when people are following Dave's plan? They've started to pay off their debt, they've put literally everything else that they have other than $1,000 toward their debt, and they are closing their accounts as they go, so they don't have any access to extra debt on a credit card, and then suddenly something happens and they need that money and they don't have it there. Now, a lot of times Dave will recommend that people just go and live with their parents or do whatever they need to do to figure it out and not get into debt. But that's really ableist in my opinion. The reason that most people recommend 3 to 6 months in an emergency fund is because it gives you time to get back on your feet in case of a true emergency. If you lose your job, $1,000 is probably not going to cut it. And I think that we can all agree after 2020 that emergency funds are really important, and we literally have no idea what's going to happen. Now, as I was doing my research on Dave's principles and going through his website, I did see that he emphasized how important it is to keep your emergency fund in cash, or basically not to have it wrapped up in investments, and I will admit that that is something that we definitely agree on. I think that you need to have a solid emergency fund, meaning in most cases more than $1,000, probably closer to 3 to 6 months of expenses, and that it's best to have this money liquid, meaning in a high yield savings account where you can access it whenever you need it. If you want to learn more about emergency funds, I will link my video up here all about them. Financial aspect number 4 that we disagree on are our investment strategies. Now, Dave is a huge proponent of mutual funds, which to me is very interesting because for someone who doesn't want to spend any extra money on anything, especially when you're in debt, I don't understand why you would want to waste your money on fees that most of the time you never see returns on. On his website, Dave states that mutual funds have a history of above average returns, but that is objectively not true. In fact, only about 29% of mutual funds beat the market. And when it comes to investing, seemingly small fees make a huge difference over time. So paying fees on mutual funds when most people do not see those returns doesn't make any financial sense to me. I do think that it is important for you to diversify your investments, but there are so many other ways to go about that have lower fees and better return rates. If you want to learn more about investing, I will link my Investing 101 video up here so you can learn all about your different options. Another part of his investment strategy is that he is very clear that you should not be investing and you should stop all investments while you are paying off your debt. Now, on the surface level, this might seem logical. If you have high interest debt, or if you have student loans or a mortgage, it might seem like, why would you invest that money when you're racking up money and interest that you could be putting toward your debt? But what Dave lays out is the fact that time is your biggest asset when it comes to investing for retirement. And establishing a routine of investing consistently and for the long term is, to me, priceless. Now, of course, there are going to be times when you have high interest debt and it makes more sense mathematically and financially for you to throw your extra money at that debt rather than investing. But Dave commonly argues for things that he promotes that objectively don't make much financial sense, that they do make sense when it comes to human behavior. Now, I can totally see the validity of that. My master's degree is in behavioral psychology. I understand the importance of taking into account human behavior when you're looking at finances, because at the end of the day, we are human. And because of that, I don't always advocate for the thing that makes the most financial sense when it doesn't make the most behavioral sense for the long run. But for Dave, who is someone who talks about the debt snowball all the time and how it might not make the most sense financially, but it makes the most sense when it comes to behaviors and establishing routine and sticking to your debt payoff journey, it seems a little incongruent in your thinking to not think about the same thing when it comes to investing. He completely ignores the importance of building up behavioral patterns when it comes to investing your money. And again, I think that this is because of that very black and white thinking. Debt is bad, being debt-free is good, and therefore anything that tries to put some nuance into that is not worth thinking about. And I just absolutely cannot get on board with this. I think that for most people, it is extremely beneficial to get into the habit of starting to invest, even if it's $10, $20, $50 a month. Even if you are in debt, time is one of your biggest assets when it comes to investing, and it can be so important to just start establishing that routine today. Plus, if you have a 401k match with your employer, you absolutely should be taking advantage of that. They have factored that into how much they are paying you. That is part of your payment package. And not taking advantage of your 401k match is a waste of money. Okay, everyone, that is it for part 1 of why I don't follow Dave Ramsey and what we disagree on financially. Don't forget, if you have questions about anything that I said, I have all of the links that I used for my research down in the description box. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you give it a big thumbs up. It really helps boost this video to the top of the YouTube algorithm and helps more people to find this content. And definitely be on the lookout for part 2, where we're going to talk about more of the nuanced, non-financial reasons that I disagree with him. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.